Well, hello, everybody, and we're on to our next episode of the Confidence Conversations podcast. And I say this about all guests, but I'm really excited today because I've got the one and only Melissa Hague here. Welcome, Melissa. Thank you for saying yes.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, you were on the list without a doubt. Before we go into anything, because today we're going to be talking about courage. And there'll probably be quite a few Brené Brown references, I'm imagining. And there'll be a lot of that, which we love. We are going to try and not to talk forever, because that could absolutely also happen. We might need to leave our listeners, viewers, wanting more. But before we go on, tell everybody, I say this in true blind date style, who you are, where you're from, what you do.
Okay, brilliant. Well, my name is Melissa. I am 47 years old and married, but, open to offers. So my name's Melissa. I'm based in Dorset on the south coast of England. And I am a leadership coach and facilitator. And a big part of my work is helping leaders and coaches to develop their courage building skills so that they can be brave with their lives, their work, and so on. So I do that through programs, through one-to-one coaching. That's what a lot of the work I do is all about, courage building.
Yeah, and I cannot recommend the work that you do highly enough, because I think we first met on a EMCC coaching networking event where you did a taster session for the Dare to Lead, the Brené Brown Dare to Lead. And I was like, oh, this sounds right on my street. It's all about courage and vulnerability, and oh, this is exciting. And then last year, which was 2023, I joined you for the Dare to Lead for Coaches program, which I can safely say has been quite transformational for me. And I don't use that word lightly, because it's not really a word that's in my vocabulary. But courage has always been one of my values. And I wanted to be braver. I think I came into the Dare to Lead wanting to be a bit braver with my clients, but had no idea that how much it would change me as well, and how much I would use the things that we learn and the things that we talked about. And also how the link with courage and confidence was a massive thing for me. So that is kind of where we're at, I suppose. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think one of the things that I always say about my programs, people invariably come kind of with their work lens, whether they're a coach or a leader. But ultimately, the program is self-development, right? And it's really about developing you as a human. And so therefore it impacts on all aspects of your life, really, and all of your relationships, both personal and professional. So that happens a lot when people come on the program. I think it isn't always what they expect, in a good way, right? It's perhaps deeper. It goes deeper than they expect when they sign up, for sure.
Oh yeah, and I would definitely say that. And I would also say that I'm now the most, and there's still work to do, don't get me wrong, I'm still on this courage road, because there's so many things that get you to lean into your courage and your vulnerability as well. But I mean, I don't think I envisaged where it would lead me, and I think now I'm much more authentically confident, courageous Gail maybe than I've ever been, through the work that we've done as well. And then of course there was the fabulous gathering as well, which I was like, yes, I want to be there. And I think on the day that gathering arrived, where we went to that beautiful venue in Dorset, I think you got the sense that I was not going to be able to contain myself and arrive at 5 o'clock, because I was so excited I couldn't concentrate on anything else. And I did. I think I arrived at 5 to 5. I was quite proud of myself.
Brilliant. Yes, absolutely. And that in itself, right, coming to that gathering was an act of courage on your part, right? Meeting with new people, fellow coaches, all of that stuff, new surroundings, new environment, meeting in person. I think it was the first time we'd met in person, because we virtual work. So yeah, lots of ordinary everyday courage, right, wrapped up in just coming to that event.
Yeah, and this is the thing as well about courage, isn't it? For me, it's this everyday courage, these things that you do every day, but that you don't dress up as courage, but that are courageous. So yeah, you're right. I mean, I think I said when I got there, we've been up and down that road so many times on the way to Cornwall on holiday. I'd never driven on that road. I mean, how ridiculous is that? So suddenly I'm driving down this road that's really familiar, but I have no idea where it is. And yeah, you're right. I'd never done anything like that before. So it was, but it was amazing. It was, anyway, enough about that, but because it was amazing and we could talk just about that and everybody would be totally like, either really excited or really like, what are you on about, Gail? What are you on about? So let's start where we always do. I want to know, first of all, before we get into the courage piece in more detail, what does confidence mean to you?
So I think that's a super interesting question because we've talked about this before, right? The link between courage and confidence. And so when I think about what confidence is, I can't help but tie it to courage, really. And I think that confidence for me comes from knowing that we can do stuff, we can try, we can experiment. And even if things don't go as we hope they will, we will be able to get back up and go again, right?
Yeah.
Because I think quite often what stops us from being confident is the fear that if it goes wrong, it'll be the end of us in some way, right? So I think it's almost like a chain reaction, right? Courage is the thing that we have to embrace and lean into, and in doing that act of courage comes the confidence to know that we can do that again and again, and over time it becomes less about courage because we have the confidence that we need, right? But I think really importantly, confidence or feeling confident for me isn't about knowing that everything's going to be all right. Confidence is about knowing that even if everything isn't all right, we know that we can get back up, we can recover, we can go again, right?
Yeah, I love that. And I crazily, it wasn't until we did the Dare to Lead work that I really made this link between courage and confidence. I mean, the two were there and they coexisted side by side for me. In one of my values was courage, and I talk a lot about confidence. I mean, the Confidence Conversations podcast, right? But actually, I genuinely don't. And Brené Brown says, doesn't she, that you can't get to which way round is that? I'm going to get it wrong, and then I'm going to feel really bad. You can't get to vulnerability without courage, or courage without vulnerability, whichever way around that is. But I think you can't get to confidence without courage. Because like you quite rightly say, you have to have that courage to go off and do something in the first place. Hence the big pants, and I'm hoping you've got your brave pants pasted behind you too. Yeah. But you need that element of courage to go off and do that thing in the first place that you've been putting off, or that you're fearing, or that went wrong last time that you don't want to do again. And I don't think I'd quite made that link until we did the Dare to Lead work.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that the other thing that I kind of think about as well is that when I feel confident, it's a really good feeling, right? It feels, I'm going to say it feels nice, right? To feel confident and like I can do this, and I can step into this, and I've got this, right? It's a really good feeling. In contrast, because in order to be courageous, we have to be able to lean into vulnerability, right? There is no courage without vulnerability. So in contrast, vulnerability does not feel good, right? It doesn't feel good. It brings up feelings of, shame and scarcity and comparison, anxiety, fear. These are all things that we perhaps would think, oh, I don't want any of that. I want to avoid all of that. But of course, avoiding those feelings that come along with that vulnerability means that you can't get to courage. And if you can't get to courage, you can't get to confidence and that great feeling that comes with feeling self-confident, feeling confident in yourself. So it is that real chain for me. And it's so easy for us to go, do you know what, this vulnerability thing, it sucks, it's really hard, I don't want to do it, I don't want to do it. But then there's something about recognizing that if that's the choice you make, if you choose, another Brené quote, right, if you choose comfort over courage, then, you know, you're never actually going to get to that great feeling that we get when we're confident, right?
Yeah. And that distinction's a great way of putting it, isn't it? How you feel when you're confident. I'm sure everybody can relate to that. It's a good feeling, right? But the courage piece doesn't feel like that. It just doesn't. And that's a great distinction between the two. Although that when you've been courageous and you've achieved that thing, that's a good feeling, isn't it? Yeah, because suddenly you're feeling, whether you're feeling more confident or you've got a sense of achievement or whatever that is. What, in contrast then, what does courage mean to you?
So I think that well, the first thing that's really important for me to say about courage is that it's not some kind of innate or noble quality that we either have or we don't have. It's absolutely a skill, right? It's a series of skills that we can develop. So we can all learn to be more courageous and develop those skills. And the other thing I'd say as well for me is that courage, you know, I think quite often when we think about courage, we think about it in the big moments in our lives, right? Whether, and those are absolutely courageous, you know, whether that's a career change or a job interview or a big presentation or, you know, these really big, you know, sometimes really kind of transformational things that happen in our lives. Absolutely, there's courage there. But for me, the courage that I want to work with for myself and with the people that I support is the kind of what Brené calls kind of everyday, ordinary courage, right? So, you know, all of those little moments that happen in our lives, you know, asking curious questions, being curious even, admitting to a mistake, you know, saying that we were wrong, apologizing, saying no to something, right? No to something or someone, you know, setting a boundary, you know, being really clear with someone about what is okay and what's not okay. You know, putting ourselves out there in some way at work, you know, being more visible. I always think of kind of putting your head above the parapet, you know, speaking up in a meeting, perhaps voicing an unpopular opinion. You know, these are all things that we're doing, you know, all day, every day, right? And it's ordinary, everyday courage. And those are the moments that I think are defining, right, for us.
Yeah.
So yeah, for me, courage is the small stuff just as much as it is the big stuff, right?
And that's fascinating for me because I think that when we talk about courage, we do think about it being this big thing, don't we? And you know, we've talked about this before, but I love The Wizard of Oz and I love The Cowardly Lion. And I love at the end of the film where he's bestowing, you know, courage on the lion. He said he had no courage except he'd like tried to scare Dorothy, travelled to the Emerald City. He'd have fought the Wicked Witch, you know, all of that. But he's got no courage. Of course he did. He had it in plenty, I think is what the wizard says. And he also talks about confusing wisdom and courage. You know, you don't have to be wise to have courage. You can build it in those everyday things. And your point about saying no, for me, courage is saying yes and no. So one of the things I've done recently is said no to a piece of work, what could have been quite a big piece of work, because it felt a little bit too far out of my comfort zone. And I'm all for stepping out of that, big pants and all that, I am. But there comes a point where actually you just feel it's maybe a bit too far at this point. And it didn't feel right. So there was part of me that wanted to go on, Gail, go on. And the other part of me that's going, actually, this is a no. And therefore I've got to be courageous to say no to that. And I think often we'll think courage is saying yes to stuff. Well, it isn't. It can be no too.
Absolutely. Definitely, definitely. And these things happen, in our kind of personal lives as well, right? With friends and family. And how often have you I don't know, gone on a night out or been to a family event that you really didn't want to go to for very good reasons, but we say yes because we think we should. And we don't want to upset people, right? We don't want to upset the family or say the wrong thing, and so therefore we say yes. And in doing that, we basically make ourselves small. We make what we need and what we value and what's important to us smaller, and we're lesser for it, I think. And so I think this whole thing around choosing courage over comfort. So the actual quote is, you can choose courage or you can choose comfort, but you can't have both, right? And so sometimes it is, today's not the day for me to step into this piece of courage, and I'm choosing comfort here. But then, when do you make the choice to step in and be courageous? It's always a choice. I think that's important.
Funnily enough, on one of the last episodes, which is with Nikki Forster, we talked about the comfort zone, and she's quite a visual person. So if there might be people that have listened to this or watched this, but she talked about her comfort zone being like a desert island. I was right there because I was like, it was like my first day back off holiday. So I was like, yep, I'm back there. That's fine. And the comfort zone being a different shape like an island is, and having this piece about where's your comfort zone when you're going into the water, because the shark's in the water. Right? But actually, if you don't go in the water, you're not going to see the dolphins. So it's about understanding where that comfort zone is for you and how it shifts and how it shapes differently. And that it doesn't have to be these big things, because maybe you're just going to paddle out a little bit further. You're not going to swim. You're not going to go and swim with the sharks or the dolphins. But if you paddle out a little bit further, you can just see them, and that's enough for you. And that's okay.
Yeah,
I love that.
absolutely.
The sharks and the dolphins. It's like, but you're not going to see the dolphins. I was like, okay. I love that. I thought that's quite a good one. Tell me what led you to the work of Brené Brown?
So I think probably like a lot of people, I came across her first TED Talk around the kind of the power of vulnerability back in, I think it was about 2013 that I literally stumbled across it. And at that time, I was doing a lot of work in leadership development. And I was struck really by two things. The first thing was that it was the first time that I'd kind of seen somebody talking about things like shame and vulnerability, and also sharing stories about their own shame and vulnerability really openly, as a way of kind of connecting. And I was just sort of blown away by this different perspective. Having spent a year, nearly all of my career in leadership development, this felt like a new perspective on what being a courageous leader and human look like. And I think also there was a piece for me when she came out with Dare to Lead, when she published the Dare to Lead book. There was this kind of, hang on, this isn't just personal development. This is also cultural development within organizations. This is about changing the way that we look at leadership within organizations. And I was curious enough to think, well, this might be the thing that's missing from what I understand about leadership. And so I think in November 2019, I had the opportunity to go and train with her to be a Dare to Lead facilitator. And it was kind of, I have to say, I debated for a while because it was quite an investment of time and money. But as alongside wanting to do the learning, it was also wanting to learn from her. And you have those moments in your life where you think, I'm not sure I can justify going, but I've got to go. I can't miss this opportunity, right? I have to go. So, and that experience in and of itself, to meet her in person and spend time with her, because she really role models this work. And that really impressed me. As a facilitator myself, we're often developing people and maybe teaching them things that we don't necessarily believe ourselves, and that's always icky and uncomfortable. But she absolutely role models it in every way possible. And so really it just took off from there for me. And that was a personal development journey and a professional development. I learned so much about myself as a human and as a leader and as a coach and as a facilitator, but mainly as a human. I was like, this is really powerful work. And then, came back from that and started to think about how the heck do I get this out there, and who do I think needs this work? Who do I think can really benefit from this work? And that led me to, Dare to Lead in organizations and for leaders, but also mainly the Dare to Lead for Coaches program. So yeah, I'm absorbed in her work, but also I think one of the things that I really enjoy about Brené's work is, first of all, it's evidence-based, so it's research-led, if you like, as opposed to just someone's idea. And also it sort of it has sort of tendrils out into lots of other work that I find super interesting, like Susan David's work around emotional agility and Kristin Neff's work around self-compassion. There's loads of other really important work that feeds out from Brené's work. So there's so much. And I always say to people who are kind of thinking about doing a program with me, I always say to them, I'm not the expert in this, but I'm absolutely leaning in and doing the work myself, and I can help you do the work as well. And I think that's really important for me, is that I'm not sat here as the most courageous coach or the most courageous leader, but I'm doing the work. And it's really hard, but I'm doing the work, and now I can help other people do the same thing. So it's a super interesting, challenging, difficult, hard, curious, wonderful place to be in terms of the work I do.
And I think you're right about the tendrils, because I wouldn't say I'm a super fan of Brené, but the more we've done the work, the more I've read, the more I've understood, and I love the fact that it's evidence based, because for me that gives it more credibility than some of the other people that are out there that are talking about courage and confidence and all of that. But I've also enjoyed the tendrils, as you've called them, the bits that, like the emotional intelligence book, that was brilliant. I love that, and in fact I'm going to go back to that again. And Kristin Neff as well, the fierce self-compassion, this idea of fierce versus tender self-compassion, I love that. And disappointingly or not, I bought the book to read on holiday, put it on my Kindle because I couldn't get hold of the book, got to holiday, Kindle didn't work. And you can't read it on a phone, can you? So I've actually found the book. So I do have that book now to read, because I do think that this, when we talk about self-compassion, actually I was talking to somebody yesterday who referenced that it's something she's doing, and it's quite American, but of course they call it loving yourself. She's like, I just find that really icky. So then of course when I said about self-compassion, she's like, oh yeah, that sounds better. I more like the sound of that, because it doesn't feel, and then this fierce self-compassion actually to me sounds quite courageous.
100%. 100%. Yeah, totally. And interestingly, when Kristin Neff talks about these two things, she talks about them as being the yin and the yang, the tender and the fierce self-compassion, right? You have to have both, and in balance, right? And I think most of us are quite familiar in self-compassion, of this idea of being kind to ourselves or loving ourselves, right? And you're right. I think a lot of people are like, ooh, that's a bit weird, or actually I'm really uncomfortable with that, because I'm used to being kind to others or loving others, not putting that to myself, right? And it feels a bit self-indulgent or selfish even, right? But it is about self-kindness, but there are other elements to it, this idea of mindfulness and curiosity around our emotions, and common humanity, and we are all imperfect human beings. None of us are alone when we fall, right? Everyone falls sometimes. And then the whole fierce piece around kind of protecting ourselves, standing up for ourselves and what we need, providing for ourselves and our needs, and also motivating ourselves towards change and growth and moving forwards, right? So it's I think self-compassion is again, not easy, but it's more complex, I think, than a lot of people realize. A lot of people think it's just about loving yourself, which yes, is a bit of it, but so much more to it, right?
And candles and bubble baths. I think is the thing that
Yeah,
that it's all pink and
absolutely.
fluffy,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. I know I sent you some questions before, and this isn't on there, but it's something that's come to mind, as we coaches do. I'd love to know what parts of the work that you have done that came out of the Brené Brown work or research that has resonated with you the most.
Oh, crikey. There's so much, right? So
Yeah.
so I'm thinking, right, okay, now hang on, let me just be careful now that I don't go off on a long ramble. So I think there are probably, I think it might be helpful just to talk for me to sort of share a little bit of from each of the skill sets, maybe around, the bits that have really, and that I use, right, in my life and in my work. And I think one of the things that we've talked about many times is what we use, the metaphor of the arena, right? And the arena is just because not everyone who's listening will be familiar with Brené's work, of course. So the arena is just a metaphor for a moment or experience where you share something of yourself, and it might be an idea, a feeling, an opinion, an experience, but you share something of yourself with no control over the outcome or what people will think. And so whenever we step into our courage, we're stepping into that arena moment, right? And so for me, the idea of understanding and being curious about what's happening in that arena, all of the things that come up, the inner critic, the voices, the messages that we hear in our heads when we choose to be courageous, all of the things around who are we trying to impress, our perfectionism, our need to look good or at least not look bad, all of those things that are happening, the people who are critical of us when we step into our courage, but also this idea of what we need in order to support ourselves. Who do we need in our arenas with us, right? Who is in our support section, and how do we practice that self-compassion? So the arena metaphor is really powerful for me, and it really helps me to prepare for those moments of courage, those ordinary everyday moments of courage, right? So it's a really practical way of really stepping into your courage. And I think probably the other key bits for me are around, there's this thing we do as humans, right? We make up stories. We tell ourselves stories, right? And so I can see you're chuckling away there, Gail. So, we make up stories. In the absence of data and information, we fill the gaps with story. And the more stories we tell, the more often we tell them, the more they become our truth, right? And so there's something for me about the ability to be able to check out our stories, and to notice the patterns and the themes that come up in our stories on a regular basis, and then having the courage to find the actual data and information that is needed in those gaps, right? Rather than the stories that may or may not be true, right? They're not always untrue. They may or may not be. So something about learning the power of stories, right? And the meaning making that we do as humans, and how that isn't always helpful for us. And how do we get back up, right, when we fall, or when it doesn't go as we would like? And this is the confidence piece, I think, as well, links into the confidence piece, because one of the things that I think we have to recognize is that if we are going to be courageous with our lives, we are going to fail. Not every time, but absolutely, we are going to fail. We're going to fall. It's going to hurt. And so the ability to develop that skill to be able to get back up in those moments and try again and go again, is super important if you want to be more courageous. You can't just develop, I can lean into my vulnerability, this is brilliant, but it isn't always going to work. So what do you do then, right? So really kind of leaning in and being able to pick yourself back up is an important part of the skill. And I think probably the other two things is we do a lot of work around values, personal values, as well as we talk obviously about organizational values, but personal values, and actually understanding what they mean in terms of how we live our lives, right? Our behaviors. So how do we live into our values? So, you know, if you mentioned, you know, one of your values is courage, right? So, okay, what does that actually mean in terms of behaviors? You know, if I was following you around like some weirdo, and seeing you in your day-to-day life, right? What would I see in your behaviors? What would I see you doing that would let me know that courage is a value? The word is not enough, right? We have to really understand what our values look like in practice. We've got to not just profess them, but practice them. And the reason that that's important for me is that it allows me to recognize, particularly in my work, but wider than that as well, I guess, it helps me to recognize when I'm doing things that are enabling me to lean into my values and live into them, right? Which is when we feel most fulfilled and in flow and at ease and all of those great things. But when we're also living outside of our values. And that links into your thing about saying no, right? You know, does this piece of work or does this event or does this social gathering, does this help me to live into my values? Or actually, is this requiring me to live outside of my values? And I don't want to do that because I don't feel good, right?
Yeah.
That's not okay. And then the other skill set that we haven't talked about is the trust one, right? Was loads of stuff in trust. But I think what's important from a courage perspective, and again, building on the confidence piece, is the idea of self-trust, right? Not just trusting others or, you know, trusting the people that you work with or your team or whatever, but trusting yourself. You know, what's your relationship with trust like? You know, do you trust yourself? And what impact does that have? What's missing in your self-trust? You know, how reliable are you? How do you hold yourself to account? Are you generous in your interpretation of your own actions and intentions? And so there's this whole piece around self-trust, which again is an ongoing, you know, ongoing development for me, really. And I think that's an important thing to say about all of these skill sets, because I think many people will come on a Dare to Lead program and think, excellent, by the end of it, I will be courageous. You know, it's going to be a light switch that I'm just going to flick on. And, you know, it's really important to say that it doesn't work like that. It's hard, right? And it's a constant journey of kind of self-development. And sometimes I get it right and sometimes I don't. And that's okay, because I'm human, imperfect and vulnerable, right? So there's lots. That was a bit of a ramble, but there's lots, right?
No,
so
but
much.
And I think some of my clients that are probably listening to this will recognize some of that, because I talk about a lot of it and yes, you and I regularly go in and out of that arena when we talk, and the things around, you know, the stories we tell ourselves. I think actually the last time we spoke, I think you might have asked me that question and it stopped me dead in my tracks, because I was like, oh, that's something I might ask a client, and now you've just asked me that question, and yeah, you're absolutely right as well. And yeah, values have been a big part, I think, and the values really come in, don't they, in the arena as well, you know, when you go into the arena. But I think one of the things that you said on the program was, you know, not if I was a weirdo following you around. I think you said, you know, if I was an alien and came down to Earth, would I be able to see your values in action? And that resonated with me, actually, because it's like, oh yeah, if I've got, not a weirdo because I'm not scared about that, but I might be scared about an alien, I'm not sure. But if that alien was following me around, what would they see? Would they see me living out my values? And the trust thing for me, I think that was one of the first things I said to you when we started. I think that was in our container building of how we were going to work together, was trust is really important to me. And we talked about the marble jar, and I love that analogy of, you know, trust is built in those small moments, but I think trust is built in those small moments for other people and for yourself, in terms of your self-trust as well. The one other thing that I would add to that, in terms of the things that all of those resonated with me, was the quote that is, the clear is kind, unclear is unkind. That has been quite transformational for me in the way that I think about how I approach things. Because the long and the short of it basically is that, you know, sometimes we do things under the guise of being kind, but actually we're trying to lessen the impact for ourselves, aren't we? Or the harshness for ourselves. And that's just not fair on the other person. And yeah, I hear myself saying that an awful lot as well.
Yeah. It's definitely one of the favorite quotes, right? The clear is kind and unclear is unkind. Yeah. Definitely. Because ultimately at the heart of this work, really, it's about connection, and it's really about conversations, right? And using those conversations as part of the way that we connect with others. And yeah, we often don't say what we want to say or need to say because we think we're being unkind, and that's about lessening our discomfort, not the other person, right? And so, this whole idea of caring candor and, all radical candor and all of those concepts, right, feed into this as well, for sure. But recognizing that if you follow the clear is kind and unclear is unkind principle, it's courageous and therefore vulnerable. So it's not easy to do. Yeah,
but and also I think that if you put the shoe on the other foot and you say, well, how often have you walked away from situations where you've walked away going, actually, I'm not clear about that. I'm really not clear whereas, okay, so if somebody has been really clear with you and you didn't like it, or it didn't land quite right, or, it felt hard, for me, they're the moments where I learn the most. They feel, and I've said to you, my emotions are always here, but it feels hard, but you're really clear. You know where you stand, you know what's going on. What
definitely.
We could definitely be on here for like a whole day. There's a whole more, maybe longer. But I'd love to know if somebody's listening to this or watching us and thinking, oh yeah, I'd really like to be more courageous. Clearly it takes practice, but where could they start? What might be 3 things that they could do to start practicing being more courageous?
So I think the first thing, 3 things. Okay, so the first thing I'd say is that recognizing that, there is no courage without vulnerability, right? The two come at the same time. So really the first thing that we have to start getting comfortable with is feeling vulnerable, right? And noticing, all of the things that come up for us when we feel vulnerable, and starting to be curious about that. Right? A lot of this is about just starting to be curious, not beating yourself up for feeling those things, but thinking, okay, what comes up for me when I'm feeling vulnerable? And how much of that is truth, how much of that is real, what's on the other side of that vulnerability. So this idea of kind of really starting to understand what vulnerability means for you, and that you can't get to courage without leaning into that vulnerability is probably the first thing. I think the second thing is that in saying that courage is, found in the kind of everyday, ordinary courage, I think very importantly is start small, right? Don't kind of think that your very first act of courage needs to be something huge. Start small. And I think the probably the third thing I'd say then is that, and it links to the self-compassion bit, is that in doing that, right, in doing all of those things, leaning into the vulnerability, starting small, having a go, being prepared to maybe fail or not get it quite right. The third thing is be really kind to yourself, right? Because you are human, you are imperfect, and you are vulnerable, right? And so, don't beat yourself up about not being courageous enough, or, choosing comfort this time rather than courage. But, be curious about what's those patterns and themes and trends that, are leading to those moments of choosing one thing or the other. But yeah, be kind to yourself, because it's really hard.
Yeah, really hard.
It's really hard. Right?
I just want to pick up.
And so in that,
sorry, no, go on.
I was going to say, so in relation to that, right? Find your support, find your tribe, find your person. It might just be one person, but who's got you, right? Because that's the person who can really or people who can support you. Super important.
Yeah, and I did a talk a few weeks ago at one of the business expos, and I talked about the Square Squad. Who's in your Square Squad of people that are really going to sort you out, are really there to support you. I just wanted to come back to the vulnerability piece, because if somebody is unsure about what vulnerability means, so I'm thinking about, we'll quite often see posts, right, where people will go, right, I'm going to be really vulnerable now, or somebody might stand up and go, I'm going to be really that isn't my definition of vulnerability. So if somebody really wants to go and understand what vulnerability is, where might they be able to find that?
Well, I think I think two things really. I think if you're interested in understanding what vulnerability really is, then you dig into the work of Brené. Definitely watch the TED Talk. First TED Talk is called The Power of Vulnerability. And of course, connect with me, right? I'm always talking about courage. And because I talk about courage a lot, there will be vulnerability there, right? Yeah. But I think one of the things that's important when you're thinking about vulnerability, or something to kind of just set the context for that, is that vulnerability is the emotion that we experience in times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Right. So that's what vulnerability is, right? Whenever you feel those things, there's a level of uncertainty, there's some kind of risk, and probably some sense of feeling exposed emotionally. That's vulnerability right there. Right.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It's interesting. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. So you lead me nicely on to say, so if people would like to connect to you or connect with you or follow you, where can they find you?
So the best place to find me is on LinkedIn. So you can connect with me on there. Just put Melissa Hague in the search bar and I'll come up. So yeah, connect with me on LinkedIn, definitely. I post on there really regularly about courage and vulnerability and all of the skill sets, really. And then I guess the other thing is to take a look at my website, that, www.melissahague.com, which gives a kind of an overview of everything I do, and you can sign up to my mailing list, those kind of things to stay in touch in terms of doing more with this work. And what I would also say is that I didn't say this at the beginning, but one of the things that really brought me to the work is I love conversations, right? I love having conversations and connecting through conversations. So, if you want to just say, Melissa, let's have a chat, right? Then, let's do that too. I'm always happy to have a conversation as well. So yeah, do that too.
Amazing. We'll pop all that in the show notes as well, so everybody's got it. Maybe we'll find the link as well for the TED Talk. So if somebody wants to access it quickly, we can just pop that in, and then they can watch that. So yeah. Melissa, thank you. That's been fascinating. I'm feeling like you'll have to come back on again, and we'll have to maybe pick a topic and really delve into it, because I think the listeners would find that really interesting, because everything around confidence and courage is absolutely fascinating. And I think when we start to break it down into what it really means, but more importantly, what it really means to us and how we can use it. And I think this idea of this everyday courage and starting small is, kind of the work that I definitely do, and the work that you do as well, in terms of, let's keep building on this. Once we've got it, we keep going. So thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. So thank you.
Amazing. And thanks everyone for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on the Confidence Conversations podcast.